In this video, we're going to learn how to make music like this. This video will be covering how to make music in the style of the duo named Bedouin. The style of Bedouin is very organic house, full of real instruments and realistic sounds, and also with a heavy Middle Eastern influence. So we're gonna get started, but before we do, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you get more videos like this one. And if you wanna download the project files, which is going to include all the samples, the presets, and everything included in this project, then click in the link in the description below or click the card up here. All right, let's get started. Oh, there we go. Bedouin's style of music ranges from 115 beats per minute to about 120 beats per minute. It's very organic sounding, which means it has a lot of realistic instruments and it doesn't sound so robotic or electronic. Because we're making music on computers, it becomes very stagnant and very stale unless you're using techniques or samples to make it feel more realistic. So I'm gonna try my best to cover that in this video. So let's jump in and start with the kick drum. So the kick drum in this style doesn't really have a lot of high end a lot of the time. Bedouin especially uses these kicks that are very punchy in the low mids, has a nice amount of energy in the low mids. It's like muffled, but not in a bad way. So it doesn't just have a lot of the high end kind of punching through. The key of this track will be in B, and the scale I'll be using is the double harmonic scale, which I'll get into in a minute. So listening to this kick, so I can just cut out that top end a little bit and make it sound a little bit softer. It doesn't take much, just a little bit. Really just cleans up that top end so it doesn't smack so hard. If your kick isn't really punchy, you can try pushing up this area a little bit. But be careful, because if you push too much, you'll get boxiness around here. So you can cut that out as well if you'd like. This kick sounds okay to me though. So let's move on. So for the bass of this style, a lot of the time the bass notes are much more drawn out or not so quick and staccato and repetitive. The reason for that, I think, is because a lot of the time staccato kind of feels faster, like it's a bit choppier and it makes the energy feel a little bit more aggressive or a little bit faster. So I'll build the bass synth first and then we can look at the scale that we'll be using for the rest of the track. So I'll grab a wavetable, throw that on the bass. I'm going to change this to a sawtooth, and I'm going to use the filter to pull this down to 24 from 12. Bring the octave down 1, so it's down to 12 semitones, and I'll bring the sustain all the way up so we have a nice solid bass sound. I do want to add a little bit more release because I want this to kind of fade out the bass so it doesn't feel so cut and dry when the bass note stops. It just gives it a bit more of a realistic, organic feel. Okay, let's grab an EQ and take a listen. So I can see all these harmonics here. I don't want so many harmonics. I do want some to give it a bit of warmth, but I'm just gonna drag this down till it cuts out most of that so I get that nice warmth. Awesome, I can put a filter over here as well, just in case. Awesome, so let's actually draw out the MIDI here. The key of the track is in B, so I'll just start at B and I'll draw out this double harmonic scale. The double harmonic in B starts B, then C, D sharp, E, F sharp, G, A sharp, then B again. Turn off the EQ so we can take a better listen. So you can hear it has that bit of a, Middle Eastern kind of desert vibe. And this scale we'll be using for the melodies in the rest of the track. So I can grab all of this by pressing Control or Command A and moving to the left with the left arrow behind the start of the MIDI clip. And then when I click fold, it's going to get rid of every other note except the ones that I'm using in this scale. So no matter what note I play now, it's in that scale that I'll be using. So I can start to draw out my MIDI for my bass line now. Turn my kick drum back on and duplicate that over. Okay, and maybe I'll add another note somewhere here, maybe the E, kind of like an up, kind of lifts up before the kick hits. Maybe a little closer here. Really basic. We're going to fill up a little bit more of the low end later in the video. So this is very open-ended bass, but with this style, it works really well, having a lot of empty space in between bass notes. Turn on the loop. and then drag this over. Then I can just duplicate the MIDI over to my sub channel, and I can duplicate over the wavetable to my sub channel, change this to just a pure sine wave, and bring this 1 octave lower, so we're just getting the sub frequencies now. And it is really low and pretty powerful, so I'll turn that volume down. I've grouped these together, and I'm going to put a compressor on the entire group and sidechain compress to the kick. To the kick, sidechain, and don't be afraid to be pretty generous with the sidechain for this. So already we can start to move on to the drums. Moving on to the drums and percussion. With this style, you want the drums to feel very organic, very realistic, some swing for sure, and you want them to sound like they're not so electronic and rigid. So I've added a few things to kind of break up that groove a little bit so it feels nice and swingy, and we'll do a couple things that will make it feel a little bit less stale and less stuck to the grid. Starting off with this tom that I have here. Sounds like this on its own. Big sounding tom, but the reason I chose it is because it has that nice kind of mid to high section that's kind of distorted. So I actually lowered this 11 semitones, so that's even lower. Sounds really cool, but obviously that low end is gonna make it sound terrible. So I just want to cut out the low end and get that nice kind of crispy, like banging type sound. It's like almost industrial. Cut off some of the high end. And then you can listen with the kick, and let's take a look at the MIDI. So I just placed it, very simple. I always recommend doing these simple hooks. It doesn't need to be super complicated, but just somewhere where it kind of increases the amount of groove. So by placing it here, the kick hits, and then immediately it plays this tom, which kind of gives it a bit of groove. So then when I also play that with the bass, it kind of fits in between the kick and the bass, and it gives it like that nice little bit of pushing motion. So I think it sounded pretty good. It's great to experiment with sounds like this, taking toms or percussive elements, pitching them all over, and then EQing them in a way that kind of fits your song. Just experiment with it and see what kind of cool percussive sounds you can actually acquire. For the hat, I have 2 hats. I usually choose 2 hats, a punchy one and a very wide sounding hat, so that I can control both the center of the mix and the width of the mix separately. We always want to have a nice middle punchy hat, but we don't want to sacrifice the width, so I like to layer up both. So we have this punchy hat here, and then I have this wider one here. So let's draw this out. Super simple. We have our 16th selected, but I want to make this even more swingy, so I'm going to add a couple extra notes on the wide one here. So one here, maybe like this, and like that. And I'll bring this velocity up, and I just want to really cut out most of that velocity. So for this one, I'll just bring that right down. Adding these little hits makes it sound much more swingy. And then I want to actually go in and just slightly offset these notes, just so that each of them is a little bit different. Makes it feel more realistic, less robotic, more humanized, and more interesting to our ears over a longer period of time. Now I'm going to add a stereo delay to the second hat, the wide hat. I'll put the feedback to 0, the dry wet to 100%, bring these both down to 1 millisecond. And this is called the has effect. Once I start to bring this one of these dials up, we're going to have the left or right signal play first, and then a time later we'll play the other signal. So this can be anywhere from 7 to 40 milliseconds. Will sound really nice. Any further you hear it kind of jump, but before that, like 17 to 20 milliseconds, it just sounds really nice and wide. And again, I'm only doing this on the wide one. The other hat is still in the middle of the mix. Best of both worlds. For the shakers, I have the same hats, but I've just slightly pushed up the start of one of them. So it's not so punchy. And then I can just draw out the 16ths. And what I'll actually do is with the velocity again, I'm going to go low, medium, high, medium, and duplicate that over. This is going to give it a nice swing. It's a little quiet, but that's because I want it to be really far in the background of the mix. Gives it a nice kind of waving, rolling motion. So I'm gonna grab a vocoder and throw that onto the shakers. And I'll push this release up a little bit and listen how this sounds like really wide, white sounding shakers now. More like maracas. So I'm going to pull that dry wet down quite a bit. Just give it a nice subtle taste of that white noise. And then I want to turn it down quite a bit because I want this to be very quiet in the mix. Almost unnoticeable, just filling up that little bit of space in the absence of the hats. These tambourines here I added are just kind of complementary to the groove. They're a little bit unique sounding, and I like to add those to make the track kind of have these different kind of percussive sounds. You're kind of listening for it, not really sure what the sound really is, but it's kind of just unique and adds a bit of extra flavor. So this hat here, it's got that double hit. It's kind of cool because it's kind of off the grid a little bit. When I cut out some of that low end though, because it is a very low sound. Maybe some of the high end as well, push it further back in the mix. If you EQ out some of the high end of sounds, it kind of pushes it a little bit further back in the mix. So if it feels like it's a little bit too forward, cut out a little bit of the highs and it'll actually make it sound further back. I noticed that in some of Bedouin's tracks, they actually use a rim shot instead of a clap. And honestly, it sounds so good for this style of music. So I did that for this example. So I have this 707 rim. I've pushed it up 2 semitones just to match the track a little bit better. And of course, push it where the claps hit. Let's take a listen how it sounds with the kick. And I want to add some reverb, so I'm going to add reverb to the whole drum bus. I haven't explained this already, but this is just a group. So this is all the instruments, and anything I place on this will actually affect the entire group of instruments that I have inside of here. So if I put the reverb on here, it's going to affect everything that's in that group. I usually use return tracks, but for this example, using the groups is fine. So I'll bring the dry wet down, decay time down a little bit, low cut, and the high cut maybe off. That sounds really nice. Let's listen with all the drums now. Great. Next I have this bongo percussion that I just bounced out to audio. Super simple, just placing some bongo hits in a place that kind of adds to the groove as well. So let's listen together. I'm adding this percussion to a place where when I turn on the percussion, it's making it feel a bit groovier and catchier. It's not slowing down the track. It's not making it feel like it's out of place or it's kind of disrupting the flow. That's what's important. Every sound you put in here, you want it to be adding value to the track. So I have this percussion loop and I wanted to talk about this specifically. It's a percussive loop that is full of some different sounds here. And some producers are afraid of using loops, but I think they're so helpful in getting your track started and filling the void of things that maybe you're weaker at. And sometimes they just honestly sound so good with the track that there's nothing wrong with using them as long as you're not solely relying on them. So I could use this Perc Loop in the track and it sounds good, but I thought that it was a bit too busy with the other elements that I planned on putting in. But I love the shakers in this loop. So what I'm gonna do is actually just use pieces of that loop. So I'll cut out all the low end except for the really, really high. And just grab those really nice shakers. And it just complements the loop a little bit more. Just fills that void of that really sparkly shaker high end, and I think it sounds really nice. So So don't be afraid to use loops. And when you do use loops, start messing around with them, start changing the EQ of them and start changing the pitch of them and experiment with them so that you can get some different stuff. You even just cut parts out of the loop that you might want to use in your track as well. So now I'm going to add two very, very organic sounding things. One is going to be a background ambient sound of a forest. This is going to give a literal organic sense because it's going to be a field recording. This is a really cool technique that a lot of producers use to give a sense of realism to their music. So I have this field recording of birds, and I just called it Birds Ambience, and this is what it sounds like on its own. So it's just adding a bit of this like nice texture with the river and the birds in the background. So I'm going to put that very quiet in the mix. And it just kind of fills up the background a little bit, giving a nice texture. But I'm going to turn this down a little bit more, and I'll take this one step further and actually try to find an area to loop that might work really well. So let's try and loop this area, see how it sounds. Maybe a little bit fast. But you hear how it's like a melody almost? Do-do-do-do-do-do. It's kind of groovy. I know that there's over here as well. I like that. So I'm actually going to duplicate that. So I'll cut this here and I'll just duplicate that over a bunch of times. And now this ambience has become more of like a actual part of the loop. It sounds pretty cool. I'll turn it down a little bit more and add some extra reverb onto there. And the other thing I'm going to do is add Foley that I actually record. Here's the audio of the Foley that I recorded with these instruments lying around my room. And of course it's going to be a little off time because I didn't really record it with a metronome or anything. Right, they're totally off time. There's some background noise in there that I don't want. So first I'll use a gate to clean up that background noise. It's just a noise gate, so I just have to bring that threshold down until we're getting those quieter parts cut out, which is fine. And then what I can actually do is I can make this so that it's on beat with the track, and the only parts that are going to hit in the Foley recording are in time with the track, which is super cool. So if I open this up, I can change this to beats, and I go to preserve, and 1/16 or 1/32 is what you usually want. I'm gonna do 16ths and change this to this arrow if it's not already there. And then I bring this 100 down to 0. And the further I go down to 0, the less of the transient is going to come through off time. So all the way at 0, only on the 16ths will those sounds actually come through. And we can listen with the metronome. So it's actually on time with the song now, and now we can use that as like a percussion loop in the background of our song, very quietly, just giving us that extra little bit of organic feel. That's pretty much it for the drums. Let's move on to the synths next. Moving on to the melodic parts of this track. The most important thing for this style of music is to be using organic style instruments, real instruments, live recordings of instruments, or synths that sound like they're kind of, real instruments. The reason for that is, like I said, it's organic. It's supposed to sound realistic and not totally computerized for the most part. So I took this sample from this guitar pluck that I got found. And then I took that part, that's because it kind of cuts out here, I actually just copied the first quarter note and placed it there. So it repeats. And it became this like kind of groovy kind of lick that you can play in the track, but I wanted to make it more interesting, so I actually reversed this second spot that I put. It's That's pretty cool. What I'm gonna do next is actually something I do in a lot of my tracks, especially with remixes that I get the stems for. And it's honestly, it's upped my production game so much, resampling like this, just because it opens up the creativity a lot, because it's something you might not think of, but when you hear it, it might kind of have a place in your tracks. I'm kind of speaking nonsense here, but you'll see what I mean in a sec. So this guitar lead, I like it. I'm gonna duplicate that guitar lead. I'll turn this one off for now because I'm not using that till the end of the track. And what I'll do is I'll drop the pitch of this by 1 full octave. And now take a listen how it sounds. Sounds pretty cool, but it's just gonna kind of muddy up the mix. It's just layering up. Just makes the guitar feel fuller, which already is a plus. But what I did extra is I cut out that sound using an EQ. So let's cut out the really low lows. And I'm gonna cut out the highs. And this is what I mean. Like, this is gonna be kind of like a bass note. So I'm gonna turn down the bass a little bit. I don't want it super, super muddy. But check out how this sounds in the rest of the track. Like, it sounds so sick. It's so, like, mysterious, I guess, because you don't really know what it is. It's just like in the background kind of hovering over, and you don't really get to grasp onto what it sounds like. And I'll take this even further by putting a delay on there. A little bit less dry wet, less feedback. It's so atmospheric, and it's adding so much to that kind of texture in the bottom of the track that it just sounds really neat. And it's filling up a little bit of that emptiness that we're getting from those really big open bass notes. Like, because the bass is so separate and there's not too many bass notes, we have this kind of like higher bass filling up some of that empty space, and it just feels more glued together. Oh, it sounds so good, if I do say so myself. Quick sidebar, if you're enjoying the content, make sure to hit the like button and hit the subscribe button so you get more videos like this one. I do teach music production as well, so you can look in the link in the description below for music production coaching, as well as music production courses for beginner and advanced producers. Using the double harmonic scale again, I'm going to create this nice soft kind of lead that's going to just fill up some of the empty space in the track and make it continuously interesting. So let's go here, I'll do a MIDI track, wavetable, grab that scale again, that's the double harmonic, push that behind again and click fold. So now we have just these notes. So now any note that I play is going to sound good in this scale because that's the scale we're using in the track. It sounds very desert-ish. Deserted? Desert? So I'll go into the wavetable. Let's just push this up to a sawtooth, cut out those high frequencies with the filter, throw a reverb on there and a delay. You know the drill, making that nice atmospheric style lead. Push the dry wet down a little bit, feedback up a little bit, more decay time. And I'll push the sustain of this up on the wavetable. So it's gonna sound okay already. Still a little too harmonic for me, so I'll cut out a little bit more high end. Some of the low end as well, just in case. That root note I can bring down a little bit. And some high end. Maybe more of a triangle. Okay, so I'm gonna actually go into the LFO, turn retrigger off, bring the rate down, the amount down, and I wanna push this onto the matrix. Push the attack up. So this is going to delay the kind of attack of the actual LFO. About 100 milliseconds. Go into the matrix, and I want to put this on my pitch. So I click pitch here, LFO 1, push this up just slightly. Maybe a little faster. Maybe a little slower, a little bit less amount, and more attack actually. Awesome. Maybe a little bit more cut off there. Push the unison on to random note. Voices can go up a little bit and amount down. Maybe I'll push the amount up a little bit more. It's just going to give us that nice kind of wafting pitch. Okay, great. That sounds pretty good. So now what I can do is actually go into the channel here and just play some notes and see how it sounds. That sounded pretty good. I actually do have a melody that I wanted to use for this, so I'm going to grab that and let's just slap that in. I'll push this up a little higher. So again, we're using that double harmonic scale. You can see the MIDI there. I just have to be careful because it is very electronic-y, synth-y. I don't want it to sound too electronic music sounding for this organic style. I think that sounds pretty good. Last thing I'm gonna do to this entire track is I'll put a little bit of glue compression on the drums here before the reverb. Make it feel nice and compressed. And then I want to add just a little bit of swing and variation to some of the percussion and the bass line. So I'm going to actually go into these Logic swings here. So you can right click on the groove pool and just search through the groove pool library of different grooves. I like to use the Logic ones. The Latin ones are good as well. Maybe I can throw that on the shakers here actually. And I don't want to put the full amount, just a little bit. And I turn the velocity down quite a bit. And then the swing 16, I'm going to put, it's the Logic swing 16 54. I'm going to actually put that on the bass to give just a little bit of variation to the bass. And I want to make sure it's not too much. So I'm going to go in and actually click this commit button. And you can see it barely did anything. But just to give it a little bit more of that, again, organic feel, put that on my clap. And I can put that on the bongos here as well. It's gonna be super, super subtle, but just a little bit to make it subconsciously more interesting. So I forgot that I wanted to record a vocal, so I kind of did. This is after the arrangement, but I wanted to show you what I actually did to make this sound the way that it sounds. I just added some reverb and delay, and I cut out a lot of the low end of the sound, and it sounds like this. I'm not a great singer, but with the reverb and delay, it honestly sounds pretty good. Without the reverb and delay, it sounds pretty... So I'm gonna bounce that down so nobody can ever hear that ever again. Now you have this vocal. And I'll place this throughout the track. The elements of the track are written. I'm going to do a quick arrangement now to make it a little bit longer. It's a little time consuming, so I don't include it in the video. But if you do want to watch that extended version, you can actually click the same link in the description below where you get the Ableton project files. So if you want the project files, the samples, the presets, everything included in this project. And if you want to see the actual arrangement process that I'm going to be doing, then click that link. But without further ado, this is my take on how to make music like Bedouin. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. video here covers a bunch of tips for organic house. So if you want to learn more, check out that video. For another how to make music like video, check this one over here. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.